Welcome back to CityCast. We have an exciting episode planned for you today. Beginning with this episode, we will be introducing a climate change series to the podcast. We'll be speaking to people from across Canada and here in Hamilton to understand how the city can be made more climate resilient. We hope this series introduces Hamiltonians to work being done around the country and in the city, and we hope that it can help listeners understand the kind of work and commitment that is required to transform cities into being climate resilient. Today, the Climate Change Resiliency Semester in Residence students will be speaking to Doug Smith, who is the Sustainability Director for the City of Vancouver, to hear how Vancouver put its climate plan in action and what recommendations Doug can offer to other cities to get their climate action plans underway. We'll let Doug introduce himself and dive right into the conversation.
So I'm Doug Smith. I'm the Director of Sustainability with the City of Vancouver. I've been working at the city for 30 years now, long time. Been in sustainability for about, 7 years. And done a little bit of everything across the city, emergency management. I was the bridge engineer. I've done transportation design. I ran our fleet for a while. And so lots of good municipal experience and government experience. And now just more recently focusing on sustainability. And looking forward to helping out and answering whatever questions I can.
So what exactly does your role entail and what are you responsible for?
So my job is mostly supporting a fairly good-sized team. We have about 25 people on our team in sustainability to essentially move forward progressive policies for the City of Vancouver, and also to work with other cities to support them on sustainability, and also to work with the provincial and federal government.
So, how does your sustainability team tie into the climate resiliency strategy of Vancouver, and what exactly does the climate resiliency strategy of Vancouver look like?
Great. So our team functions, probably the best way to describe it would be as a hub. And for other cities that are out listening, or people who understand how corporations work, there's certain groups within a city, finance is a good example, or occupational health and safety, where there's often a central hub where they do sort of the policy work and they make sure things are being done properly and they report it out. But a lot of the work actually happens in different departments. And sustainability, we try to model that same sort of approach. So while we're the hub where we develop a lot of the policy, we set the long-term direction and goals, and we monitor and report on a lot of the work that's happening, we rely on a lot of our partners within the city, whether that's engineering transportation or our neighborhood energy utility or our park board, or even our fleet, to move a lot of the work forward with support from us in sustainability.
So a couple years ago, Vancouver set the goal of being the greenest city by 2020, and during that time, various plans and strategies were developed. Can you talk a bit about that and what something like the Greenest City Action Plan is?
Yes, absolutely. The Greenest City Action Plan was a 10-year comprehensive environmental action plan. So it wasn't just a climate plan. It wasn't just focused on carbon. It was kind of everything ecological or environmental associated with the city. So it covered your traditional carbon-related things like transportation and buildings, which have a really big impact on our carbon footprint in the city, but it also covered things like local food, green jobs, air quality, water use. It talked about what we call collective action or lighter footprint, which is actually getting the community engaged and getting people involved in working on the climate work as well. It even covered other areas such as no, I think I covered most of them. But yeah, it's a broad plan. It was a 10-year plan, and we did develop it with a lot of input from the community. We did engagement with over 35,000 people across the city of Vancouver to try to get ideas of what they thought we should include, what shouldn't be included. And also we consulted with a team we called the Greenest City Action Team, which was a group of experts that we brought together to kind of give us advice and saying, if you're going to be a sustainable city, what are the main things you need to cover to be that sustainable city? And that helped us set the targets and goals and our ambition for the next 10 years. So essentially 2010 to 2020.
So speaking of that, were these plans constructed before or after Vancouver declared a climate emergency? I'm asking this question specifically because I want to understand what is the importance of declaring something like a climate emergency, and how does that possibly shift the needle on climate work?
So regarding the climate emergency, that was only declared very recently. That was in 2019 when that was originally declared. And so what happened is we did the Green City Action Plan, which had a pretty significant carbon agenda in there, mostly buildings and transportation and building lots of bike routes and more transit, things to reduce the use of fossil fuel. And we had a pretty ambitious target, which was reducing our carbon emissions by 33% by 2020. We didn't get anywhere near that target. We actually only got about 9% reduction in greenhouse gases, which is not nearly enough to be on track to where we need to if we're going to be aligned with the Paris Accord of 1.5 degrees. So in 2019, City Council said, you know what, you guys are doing a good job, but you're not doing enough. You need to do more. This is really serious. The planet is not on track for hitting our target. So we're going to declare a climate emergency. And they gave us, the city staff, basically permission to go back and say, what do we absolutely need to do to hit those targets? And those targets that we're talking about are a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. We didn't hit our 2020 targets, but we really, really want to hit our 2030 targets. And we actually told City Council, like, this is going to be difficult. This is not going to be easy. It's going to be fairly progressive policies, and it's going to be expensive. And Council unanimously said, that's okay. We understand it. This is really important. It is an emergency. We need you to do this for our community. So we went off and worked on the Climate Emergency Action Plan, which was just approved by Council in November 17th of 2020. And within that plan, it was really valuable for us to hear it from Council that this was an emergency, that this was a top priority, and we needed to put a lot of resources towards it. So we spent a little over a year activating different groups within the city, transportation, a big part of it, our fleet, but also activating members of the public and the community to get their engagement, and came up with this plan. And we really focused on two pieces that we hadn't done as well before. Those would be modeling and finances. We brought in a couple of professional companies to help us model what the changes we were proposing, the policy changes, and what impact they would have on our carbon. So we had a lot more confidence that if we implemented these things, we could actually get the outcomes we're looking for. And the second thing is we put a really strong lens on financing around this to make sure there was actually money in place to do this work. A lot of cities have really ambitious plans and say, hey, we're going to do this. We're going to reduce our carbon by 50% or 30%. But if you don't actually put your money where your mouth is, you're not going to be successful in accomplishing that.
So that's very interesting. You said that you got unanimous support from councillors for this new plan. That's a huge accomplishment. So, can you speak a bit about how to get all councillors on board and make everyone realize the importance of supporting something like this?
Well, the interesting part of that is we had unanimous support to declare a climate emergency, and we had unanimous support to move forward with a lot of the big moves that we had within there. But when it actually came to the November 17th report, and we had warned Council, like, there's some really aggressive things in here. Plus, we're right in the middle of COVID, which had a huge impact on the community, both financially and just other impacts to people. So it wasn't unanimous on November 17th. When the final report came and said, here's the actual policies we're going to move forward on, there was a lot of conversations from Council, and some of the pieces were very challenging for Council to approve. And those were things like transport pricing, essentially a tolling system where we would toll people to drive into downtown Vancouver. Other things that were challenging were the idea of putting parking fees everywhere in the city on every street. So every car parked on every street would have to pay an annual fee. And then the other thing that's also very challenging is retrofitting buildings. It's relatively easy to make new buildings zero emission, but to take an existing building and to retrofit it to make it zero emission is very expensive and very challenging. And so Council really had a lot of deep conversations with staff and with the public about those three things, and still decided to proceed. The majority of Council still directed us to proceed, though there was a handful of councillors who just thought it was too much, too soon, especially in the face of COVID. So we are proceeding, but it wasn't unanimous on November 17th.
I see. I think what's interesting about Vancouver is that with this new plan, it's the first city in Canada to introduce the transport pricing and congestion tax. How can Vancouver be a leader in Canada in getting other municipalities to see a similar future forward?
I really think the transport pricing, and like you said, we're the first in Canada, and we may be the first in North America. A lot of other cities are talking about it, but nobody's done it yet in North America. It's very common in Europe, and it took a long time for it to get common in Europe because it is a controversial move, but it is also a very effective move to reduce pollution. Um, what Vancouver can do is, I think, we can approach transport pricing not as a tax or not as a punitive measure, by saying we're going to punish you if you want to drive downtown. But I think we actually want to approach it as a way to make downtown better. So what our downtown needs, our businesses need, is not cars. What they need is people. And people who want to spend time in the downtown. And one of the big drawbacks of our downtown right now is it's filled with cars. So you're walking down these beautiful tree-lined streets with these nice businesses, and you can't even talk to the person next to you because there's traffic and cars and noise and pollution that you're smelling, and it's not a very pleasant experience. Whereas you go to a lot of European cities, they have not banned cars, but they've greatly reduced the cars or made their streets car light. And all of a sudden, the streets are for people now. They're not for cars. And these make it much more attractive. And they're filled with people, thousands of people walking around downtown, shopping, going to grocery stores, going to restaurants and coffee shops, and they're thriving. And so I think that's the vision we want to paint for our downtown and also for other cities who want to do this leadership work. This is not a punitive measure. This is actually about making your downtown more attractive and more financially resilient to changes like COVID. For example, if we had a largely walkable downtown that had big wide sidewalks and streets that were open for bikes and pedestrians as opposed to for cars, that would be, if we had COVID hit us again or hit us, during that time, it wouldn't be a problem because you don't have to worry about social distancing. You have a lot more space. You could build more patios outside. You could respond to that. It's a much more resilient system to build your city for people as opposed to building it for cars.
Definitely. And I think a benefit of policies like this is that it helps shift people's reliance on cars. And that's one of the huge problems in Hamilton as well, that it's super car centric. And so I think this helps create a behavioral change within the general public.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a significant behavioral change, and it's a challenge. People don't like change, and so putting any kind of change in place is always going to be difficult, socially and through a whole community. But if you look at the benefits of moving to other modes of transportation as opposed to driving everywhere, not only is it better for the environment, it reduces pollution, reduces greenhouse gases, it's quieter, you can actually get more people on the road, per lane kilometer, using transit or even walking and cycling, especially in a city. But it's also much more affordable for everybody.
Mhm.
Cars are crazy expensive. Even if you buy a cheap used car, you're still going to spend $10,000 a year just putting fuel in that car and maintaining it and paying for parking. It's crazy how expensive cars are, and they spend most of their time sitting and being parked. It's a really poor use of a resource. If you live out in a rural community or out in a farm somewhere, absolutely, you're probably going to need a vehicle to get around. And eventually that'll be an electric vehicle or a hydrogen zero emission vehicle. But for cities, if you live near a city or in a city, you really don't need a car. And so the cities actually have an obligation to make the cities more approachable, more effective for people who don't need cars because it's a money saving option as well.
Yeah, I think often one of the criticisms against this is that building these new spaces would cost so much taxpayer money. But also, I think what a lot of people fail to realize, as you mentioned earlier, is that cars require a lot of money to get up and running and for their upkeep.
Yeah, and not only the cost of the cars to the people who are driving the cars, the cost of the road space is not paid for by the people who drive. It's paid for by everybody. Fuel taxes pay for a small percentage of road space. The rest of the road space, they paid for the maintenance and the traffic lights and accidents and the health issues are all paid for by the general community. And so we are all subsidizing, whether you have a car or not, you're subsidizing someone else to drive. And that's another thing we need to shift away from.
Definitely, I think it's more than just a car. It's a bigger systems issue and it has an impact outside of just being a vehicle. But going back to something you said earlier, that one of the challenges when you were developing the plans in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is retrofitting old buildings. And I know Vancouver has a zero emissions building plan, and in my research, I saw that the city has been meeting a lot of its targets or is well on its way to meet a lot of its targets. Can you speak a bit more about what that is and how that works?
So back in 2015, the city developed our zero emission building plan. And the intent there was really to focus on new buildings, because every new building that isn't zero emission becomes an older building that you need to retrofit. So it's always good to start with your new buildings first to figure out, where you're going to do that. On top of that, there's a lot more profit, a lot more money available for new buildings. And so the ability to get the building industry and the community to build greener new buildings is easier than it is to retrofit buildings. So you want to start there and build up capacity. So the industry gets it, so the supply chain has it, so they can buy the windows and the heat pumps and the other equipment you need to do zero emission buildings. And since 2015, we've slowly increased our requirements. And essentially by 2023, pretty well, I would say 90% of all new buildings in the city of Vancouver will be zero emission. And so there's still a few outliers there, industrial buildings, schools. We haven't figured out exactly how to make those zero emission, but they're a small percentage. So we have time to figure those out. Now that we've got most of the new building stock going to zero emissions, the next step is getting the existing buildings. And these are difficult to do, especially from an affordability perspective. The last thing we want to do is, find an old rental building that's got relatively good low income rent and force them to retrofit that building. Because if you force them to retrofit the building, two things might happen. Either the cost of that retrofit, which could be quite expensive to put in new windows and new boilers and new heat pumps, would just get passed on to the tenants, and that becomes an affordability issue. The other thing that could happen, which is even worse, is the building owner says, wow, it's going to be really expensive to retrofit this building. I'm just going to tear it down and build a new building. And just by default, you're going to now have a bunch of people who are homeless, and you're going to build a building that likely has more expensive rent in it. So we're not going to start with rental buildings. We're going to really start with the people who can afford to retrofit their buildings. And those two categories are commercial buildings. These are, large buildings. They could be 3 stories, they could be 20 stories, but they're buildings essentially run by large businesses. They have organized and sophisticated building management systems, and they know they can save money. They also have access to capital. And so by saying, we're going to expect you to retrofit first, these building owners, in a lot of cases, can actually see a business case. They can go, yeah, I have to spend some money today, but you know what? It's going to save me money over the next 5 years. It's a good investment for me. I can borrow the money. I can put it in the building. My tenants will be happy because they'll have better air quality. They'll have better air conditioning. They'll have better heat. And also I can advertise as a green building now, and I'll be able to attract better tenants. So commercial buildings are relatively easy to retrofit. They still need a push from government to make it happen, which we're going to do. But they can do it. The next step, as far as building retrofits, is going to be single family homes. And while there's a lot of single family homes that are lower income, we're going to have to stay away from those initially. But there's a lot of very, very rich single family homes in Vancouver. A single family home in Vancouver is $2 million for an average house. So if we start with houses that are $4 and $5 million and even higher, and say, you know what, you're going to need to retrofit your house, chances are they can afford it. And on top of that, they will probably want to do it. There's significant benefits by going to a heat pump and going to a different system. The nice thing about a heat pump is it comes not only with good heat for your house, it also brings air conditioning. And a lot of newer homes in Vancouver don't have air conditioning because it's not a hot climate, but it's getting hotter all the time. And so this allows people to upgrade their heating to air conditioning. And it also provides better air quality. And we're seeing that as a significant issue in Vancouver. We see a lot of wildfire smoke that's happening for weeks and weeks over the summer. And so these new systems actually filter your air at a very, very high level and protect you inside the house from this risk for pollution from smoke from fires. So those are the two groups we're going to be focusing on, is commercial and larger homes initially for our retrofit program.
You bring up a great point about doing this in an equitable way and not putting the burden on those that are most vulnerable in society to carry forward this work, but rather reaching out to those who have the capability to enact change. Also, for example, you talked about how as the climate gets warmer, we'll need to make a shift towards air conditioning and cooling. How do you ensure that this is done in a sustainable way?
Yeah, the nice thing about heat pumps is they're very, very energy efficient. They can be anywhere from 3 to 5 times efficiency. So that means for every kilojoule of energy they take from an electricity perspective, they can actually produce 3 to 5 kilojoules of heating or cooling. And so it's a really nice system. It's also a very established system. Every fridge is a heat pump. So we have been doing heat pumps for a long time in the world, and heat pumps for buildings are very common back east in Eastern Canada and the Eastern United States, and they're really, really common in Europe and in Asia. So eventually, the West Coast here will get really comfortable with heat pumps, and we'll see some significant upgrades for that. So there are lots of benefits to. Another way to ensure efficiency with heating and cooling is really through greenery. Putting a lot more trees, putting blue-green roofs in place, and not just green roofs, but blue-green roofs, which is a way to have a green roof, but also has water associated with that. So you've got greenery and water storage on your roof. Will help regulate temperatures, both hot temperatures and cold temperatures within your city and within your building. So you're not actually relying on electricity or other sources to manage your heat and your cooling.
So, without getting too technical, could you explain what a heat pump is?
A heat pump is essentially a compressor that runs on electricity. And if you take heat from, um, if you take uh, a fluid and you compress it, and so that fluid can be freon, it can be carbon dioxide, it could even be a liquid. If you compress that fluid, it actually gets warmer. And so if you wanted to heat your house with it, you would take your fluid in your heat pump. So it's often carbon dioxide is actually one of the newer fluids that we use there, even though it's a gas, and you compress it. It actually warms up, and then you run it through a series of coils, just like a radiator almost. You blow air over it, and that air is now warm, and that heats you up. It's pretty straightforward. You can also do the reverse, where you compress your fluid, but you actually then allow it to decompress. And when you decompress a fluid, it gets cold. So if you notice when you spray anything out of a spray can, it actually is colder because it's decompressing a fluid that was already compressed. So it actually takes heat out of the air, and that's how you produce cooling in a fridge, and that's how you produce cooling for air conditioning as well. And what the heat pump also does, why it's called an actual heat pump, is it uses energy from the surrounding area from outside. So let's say it is, if we're going to heat, let's say it's 15 degrees Celsius outside, but you want to heat it up to 20 degrees inside your house. You need to, you don't just raise the temperature inside your house. You actually have to heat the air coming into your house, but you heat, you use the actual existing energy that's in that air. That 15-degree air actually has energy in it. It's been heated to 15 degrees, so it actually has a lot of energy there. And your house is this big, whereas the outside is infinitely big. And so you can take that energy from outside and actually use it to support adding heat to the smaller space inside your house. So it's a little bit of an odd concept, but it actually uses external energy, external heat that's already out there to help heat the inside of your house, and vice versa when you're cooling.
Could you, in theory, cool the outside if you were to sap enough of the energy?
No. I mean, the outside's too big. You don't have to worry about it. What I mean, you're talking about the air, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, maybe if you were standing right next to a heat pump, you're going to get some cold air blowing on you, but you're not going to have any actual impact on the environment that way. There is an issue when you use geothermal heat, which is the exact same principle, except instead of using air, it's called an air source heat pump. You're using a ground source heat pump where you pump coolant into the ground, and you take energy out of the ground. There's actually a risk that you can freeze the ground. Because you have a much smaller area that you're actually pumping energy into. The ground's typically warmer, and even in the wintertime, it's quite warm, even down deep. But there's a risk that if you take too much heat out of there, you end up freezing the ground, which can lead to aquifers freezing or lead to other issues. So you do have to manage that a little bit more closely.
So, is this kind of technology set into the standards that are used for building new buildings or even retrofitting old ones? I know Vancouver really encourages the use of passive house standards in its building code, so can you speak a bit about what this is and whether this is a part of that?
Yes, absolutely. So for new buildings, and even for retrofits, we really try to allow the building designers, the architects, the engineers to have as much control as possible. We really set the outcomes we want. And the outcomes typically have three you almost think of it like a box. And you have to build your building to fit within this box. And one of those boxes, one of those sides of those boxes is energy. We don't really want to be wasteful in energy. You could build a zero emission building, but has really terrible energy wasting. So we put limits on how much energy you can use in a building. We also put limits on how much heat a building can lose. So we make sure the building is properly insulated. So you don't just build a really cheap leaky building and it's going to cost a tenant a fortune in electricity bills to run the building. And so you have to make it energy efficient as well. So lots of really good insulation, and passive house is one way to describe a really well insulated building. And then the third thing is we actually set limits on greenhouse gases. And so the limits on greenhouse gases means that, yeah, you could use a little bit of natural gas, but really you're going to probably have to use electricity or some other source, maybe renewable natural gas or something else to provide energy for that building. So with those three parameters around that box in that building, it drives the building engineers and the architects to use things like heat pumps. But there's other things you could do. If you have a really small, super energy efficient building, you could just use a baseboard heater. You don't need a big fancy heat pump. A baseboard heater is really cheap, not super efficient, but you don't need a lot of energy for a small passive house. Small passive house, most of the year, will be heated by the people in the building, the TVs, the hair dryers, your washing machine, your dishwasher, your stove. All of those things give off waste heat. That waste heat will actually keep your house warm enough for most of the year, and you'll only actually need to turn on the heat for maybe a few days of the year for a small passive house. Another option, besides heat pumps and just regular baseboard heaters, is district energy. And district energy is very common in Europe. It's been used a little bit back east, and we're starting to use it more in the West Coast here. And what that district energy means is that there's a central plant that produces your heating and your cooling even. And all of the buildings nearby are connected to that plant with pipes. And typically the plant will send heated fluid in that pipe. And so it could be water, it could be glycol, it could be some other sort of fluid, depending on what the plant's doing. And that water, that fluid goes into the buildings. It typically gets a heat exchanger within the building. And then that heat is distributed through the building through radiators or other systems to create hot water for the building and to heat that building. In Vancouver, we have a district heating system called a neighborhood energy utility. And this one's really cool. It sits on top of this massive sewer pipe that comes out of our downtown core. And that sewer is filled with, well, what sewers are filled with. Everybody knows what's in a sewer. But it's not just from toilets, it's also your wastewater from your dishwasher, it's from your shower, it's from your washing machine. And all of those machines usually use heat and just dump that heat down the drain, and it's wasted energy. So we put a heat exchanger in right into that sewer, and we basically suck all of the heat out of the sewer, and we use it to heat a whole neighborhood in Vancouver just from wasted sewer heat. And so there's lots of opportunities to use heat. We have a couple of buildings in downtown Vancouver where they're next to a computer office like TELUS, and their computers use a huge amount of heat. The server rooms create a huge amount of heat, and they actually take the heat from those rooms, put it through a district energy system, and use it to heat other buildings. So essentially reusing that waste heat as opposed to cranking on the air conditioners and blowing it outside.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of our conversation with Doug Smith. Keep a lookout for part 2 of this interview, which will be released shortly, where Doug will talk further about building climate resilience. We'll see you soon.